Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in an increasingly complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host and founder of TrueMark and the Anti-Greenwash Charter. Our article this week is Beyond Sustainability, Businesses Embrace Regenerative Systems Thinking by Hannah Pathak, 2025, which charts the shift from extractive to regenerative business. And we're asking what this really means beyond the buzzwords. And I'm delighted to say that our guest today is Zoe Duvall, independent climate consultant, co-founder of Overstory Earth, and former strategy lead at Mott MacDonald, with deep experience shaping ESG and sustainability across sectors. Zoe, it's absolutely brilliant to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It's fab to be here with you, Charlie.
Now, Zoe, I know you've had a bit of a week personally. We've got some big news as to sort of break on the show, if you don't mind me doing so. Fantastic to hear of your engagement this weekend. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. It's nice to share some happy news. Yeah, I've been with my partner 10 years. So it feels like a really exciting milestone for us.
Excellent stuff. Excellent stuff. And I have to say, hearing about the proposal that your partner did, I mean, massive brownie points to the chat. He should write a guide on how to do it well. It was absolutely sensational. But that's for another. Well, there you go. He's had a shout out. That's perhaps for another show. Zoe, I very briefly introduced your work, and I think most of our listeners and viewers are going to be jumping onto LinkedIn immediately and thinking, oh my goodness, what's Overstory? And, you know, what was she doing at Mott MacDonald, etc. So before they kind of get there, and to keep them engaged with our audio and video, would you mind just providing us with a bit more kind of meat on the bones as to perhaps, you know, what you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I recently left my consulting job to move independently, which feels really exciting and daunting in equal measures. So my independent advisory practices focuses on sustainability, climate change, and regenerative strategy. So we'll talk a bit about that today. Prior to that, I spent just shy of 8 years in a more corporate setting at a global engineering, development, and management consultancy at Mott MacDonald, where my focus was also sustainability, ESG, and climate strategy. And I had a really exciting and diverse career at Mott, which was super interesting and not very linear and led me to lots of interesting places. But something I'm most proud of is at London Climate Action Week this year, we launched PCRAM 2.0, and PCRAM stands for the Physical Climate Risk Appraisal Methodology. It's a methodology we developed, McDonald contributed to on behalf of an industry coalition. So it was originally led and developed, that was launched at COP26 and led by the Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment. This year it's been led by the Institutional Investor Group for Climate Change, lots of acronyms. We launched the second iteration at London Climate Action Week. So I'm really proud to have been involved throughout that process. It's an example of some really industry-leading collaboration. And it was sort of leading that and launching that at London Climate Action Week that gave me the confidence to start my independent practice. So I want to be leading much more industry collaboration and having more agency and empowerment to kind of really drive that kind of systems change that we need.
You mentioned there built the confidence through delivering this project to then sort of strike out on your own. Again, for somebody who's had your kind of a level of success in the corporate setting to the point that you have, and then going, what's it been like to sort of start up on your own? Like, what have the last few months been like for you personally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And actually, I've spoken to a lot of people who are considering it and wondering what it feels like. It's something I've had a calling for quite some time. I had a really brilliant team I was working with. I loved my job. I wasn't sort of compelled to leave for any kind of negative reason. It was more, I just had this calling that just got louder and louder to start my own thing. And because I was really fortunate to be leading a lot of our external work with these industry collaborations, I'd sort of built my external network sufficiently to kind of give me the confidence that actually I'll be okay in whatever I do. Because I think often for people, the biggest risk or the biggest worry is that there wouldn't be enough work coming in. But actually, I haven't found that to be the case. There's lots of opportunity. And it's about kind of following your excitement and feeling confident to to really carve out your own path. So that's been, it's been really exciting. And actually, I've really loved being able to embrace opportunities that I wouldn't even have known existed unless I was in a space where I was kind of exploring and able to kind of welcome in those and embrace those opportunities. If anyone is interested about taking the leap and kind of going it alone and going independent, or taking a more entrepreneurial path, please reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll be happy to have a conversation, because it's not so easy. It is daunting.
Zoe, we've got to ask a question. How did we get here? How did we ultimately end up with you at this stage in your career? At this point, like, let's go back to, if you can, like a really strong kind of formative experience that really helped sort of shape your view of the world and has ultimately driven you to do what you've done.
Yeah, so I wasn't planning on getting too personal, but this question, I couldn't really help myself, because when I think about what kind of was quite formative in my life, I think back to an experience that probably shaped me the most, which was losing my dad at age 11. And for context, he was someone who was super entrepreneurial. He was a serial entrepreneur. He was championed as this blue sky thinker. He was part of the team that developed the first online bank, Egg, and invented peer-to-peer lending at our family home with a bunch of other entrepreneurs. And actually, I found a quote which is quite surprising, and it kind of blows my mind that this still exists on the internet. But Bill Gates quoted that my dad was the most dynamic man he'd ever met. So quite an innovative guy. But with all of that kind of dynamism, he was very into his work, as you can imagine. And personally, I think he was quite addicted to work. And unfortunately, that meant he died really young, and died in his 40s, leaving a family and 4 kids behind. And so I found that, without getting too deep, that's really shaped my worldview. I've sort of always felt really ambitious, creative, and innovative like my dad. And I literally thought it was possible to change the world, following in his example. But it also taught me the importance of having to prioritize your health and have balance in life. So that ambitious side really kind of set me up well for corporate life. And I really channeled that big picture energy and that strategic thinking that I got from my dad into areas I really cared about, like sustainability and the kind of purpose that I've always driven towards. But then on the flip side, I've sort of had that balance in the back of my mind. And that was really exasperated for me when a couple of years ago I had a bit of a health scare, and rather than kind of power on through, I was really fortunate enough to kind of see that as a sign and a signal, and really kind of take it seriously and take a break. But in true style, I can't really sit on my laurels. So me and my partner ended up building a campervan and spending kind of 6 months traveling around Europe, and just really taking a much kind of slower pace of life. And it took me a few weeks to decompress from that feeling like I needed to do all the time, that I needed to optimize, maximize, and just take a really kind of slower pace of life. And I really learned so much in that time. It was really quite a life-changing trip. But something that was really quite powerful was being much more connected to nature and the rhythms of nature. And so I learned a lot from that trip. But actually, I think it's that combination of, yes, you can change the world, you can be ambitious, you can kind of follow your excitement, but in a way that's balanced and healthy and happy, so that you can kind of keep going and keep that purpose through life. And that's what's kind of led me here today. I have started on a bit of an entrepreneurial journey, following in my dad's footsteps, starting my first business to connect more people in cities with nature, to really give others that opportunity, like I experienced in that 6 months, to connect with nature, to slow down, and to kind of feel more balanced.
What is it that you've sort of learned from that 6 months that you had out, if you like, that you sort of maintained in terms of the way that you're approaching your work now? Like what are the sort of non-negotiables for you in terms of looking after yourself?
Yeah, the biggest thing I learned was that you only have a finite amount of energy and time. And so actually following your excitement and following your purpose is so key, because it will feel much more nourishing than following something that doesn't light you up. So because you have this finite resource, use it wisely and use it in an area that you really care about, because that will also make your body and your mind and your spirit sing. And the other thing I would say is something I really learned is how to be more in tune with my body and what my body needs, which is something I didn't really know before. But I now take kind of micro moments in my day to just have a kind of grounding moment, kind of check in with myself. If I'm feeling energetic, it's green, let's go. Let's kind of lean into high energy work. If I'm feeling like I need a break, I'll take that break. And I guess that's something that independent consultancy life and entrepreneurship can give me, that flexibility in order to be more in tune with the rhythms of my energy.
Which I mean, I'm sort of committed to relaying this to my own experience. I totally get that. It's weird with doing your own thing, because you have got that sort of get out of jail free card, is not the right turn of phrase, but essentially you've got that capacity to say, no, do you know what? I'm not feeling quite right on this at the moment, so I'm going to give myself that breathing space. But at the same time, it's so difficult, because when it is your passion, it's your art, it's your creativity, it's your identity, it's so hard not to get, completely sucked in and, ultimately engrossed in it to such an extent where you realize that you're really doing nothing else other than playing with your project, playing with your, with your purpose. That's such a difficult thing to get balanced and get right.
Something that really helps me, and something I would really recommend to others, I think how you set up your day is really critical. So the first things you do in the morning and having your morning routine are so critical. And it also means if you get excited and end up working many more hours, at least you nailed the morning. So I don't look at screens or phones for the first kind of hour or hopefully 2 of my day. That doesn't always go to plan, but mostly I try to do that. I always try and get out in the morning, rain or shine. Again, nature's with us, not against us. And sometimes it's really beautiful to get out in the rain too. Don't be scared of it. And I do sort of breath work and grounding and just have a really nice morning. It's really nice to have some moments with yourself. I love coffee, so I make sure I kind of have a really intentional coffee in the morning and really enjoy it. And then I start my busy, hectic day, but having had that kind of grounding. And if I don't get a chance to check in again that day, at least I know I had that kind of morning. It's very easy to do that first thing. It's much harder to do that after you've already kind of started with the rhythms of your day.
I think it comes back to a colleague of mine referenced this and said, we need people working in sustainability to manage themselves sustainably. And I think that sort of encapsulates the whole thing perfectly, because it's a long-term thing. It's something that we need people to feel not burnt out and to feel that they can contribute for over a long period. For now, though, Zoe, could we move on to the Hannah's article? Would you mind just starting by just giving us a bit of a summary and an overview of what's in the piece? And then I'm just going to ask you, once you've done that, to kind of pick out whatever you thought was most interesting in it.
Yeah, absolutely. What I would say firstly is it's a very short and punchy read. So it's something you can read on your lunch break. It's really concise, but although it's concise, it's very thought-provoking. So it's called Beyond Sustainability, Businesses Embrace Regenerative Systems Thinking. And what the article does, Hannah describes really eloquently this move from sustainability, which is essentially historically has been just to do less harm, to actually this new way of thinking, which is to proactively seek a redesign of the key systems that we rely on to thrive. So this includes our health systems, economic, energy, food, social, and planetary systems. And the term regenerative systems thinking is really just describing that mindset shift, recognizing how intrinsically linked all of these systems are. And by adopting a just and regenerative mindset, you can move from this quite meek and unsatisfying level of action that we've seen to date, of just preventing harm, which we know hasn't been good enough, to actually contributing to a fairer, thriving, and prosperous future. because all of this sounds quite lofty. But what I love also is that it shows that we have all of the tools already today. There's no kind of silver bullet technological solution that's just coming around the corner. If we just wait, it will solve everything. It's more about actually using what we have, but just redistributing shifting from that kind of extractive short-term mindset to much more long-term value creation, one that strengthens our resilience, but also sparks innovation, finding the opportunity in the tensions between those systems and working with forces rather than against them. The article really builds on donut economics. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Kate Raworth's work in 2017, which was really a reimagining of economic success. It sort of described as a donut, the American style, with a hole in the middle, where you have the kind of inner ring, which is all our social foundations, our housing, our education, healthcare, etc. And then the outer ring, which is the ecological ceiling, or what we also call as planetary boundaries, climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, etc. And that safe space is where humanity can thrive, where your needs are met without breaching the Earth limits. So what I think this article really points to is some of that thinking that's already been starting to embed and percolate, but builds on that and says, actually, all we need to do is shift our mindset to one that allows us to thrive rather than this kind of extractive view. The only thing I would add is perhaps an example, because I think people have thought of the word regenerative. Maybe the example that springs to mind is in agriculture. I think that's where people think of regenerative practices the most, where it's essentially a farming practice where you can build healthy soils whilst also maintaining water retention, boosting biodiversity and sequestering carbon, whilst also maintaining strong yields and the kind of economic incentives. So that's an example where by building in regenerative practices, you can have those kind of co-benefits that allows that thriving community whilst also kind of keeps your lights on.
I'm going to throw the devil's advocate sort of elephant in the room question at you. You mentioned in the article, alludes to this whole idea that when we were looking at sustainability, we were talking about, do the least amount of harm that you can. What do you think of those that view regenerative as essentially a sort of an evolution in the language that we're using, but essentially, regardless of how regenerative a practice becomes, the creation of a product becomes, perhaps, ultimately it still essentially does some harm. And that's the nature of production. What would be your rebuttal to that position?
Oh, juicy question. So this is a really fair challenge because of the amount of growth that we've had over a really long period of time, because we're kind of incentivized to keep that growth going and incentivizing profits. It's really difficult for us to imagine a world that is purely regenerative, because we can't really see many practices as an example today. But I do think if we move from this view where we're minimizing harm and whatever that means, which is quite wishy-washy, through to what we experienced with ESG, which was a slight build with considering both your risks, your opportunities, and your impacts. That was a slight build to kind of think, okay, there's some opportunities here. There's also impacts that I'm creating as well as impacts on my business. To this pure systemic thinking, which is really quite a shift in organizational thinking. So that's the kind of first challenge. You are considering a much more longer term view, which is going to really significantly reduce that harm, but also lead to kind of improving, because you're going to want to exist in 100 years' time if you're thinking long term enough and building that resilience. And because you're thinking systemically, actually it's resilient by nature. So actually, to kind of go back on your challenge, I think if we're purely thinking regeneratively, systemic regeneration, that kind of systems thinking, it's resilient by nature. It's just by nature, and it considers how kind of people, planet, and economics will work in harmony. So I think it can be done. I just don't think we have many examples apart apart from kind of agriculture, I guess, is the furthest along that we can point to. But there's a real resurgence in systems thinking. Obviously, this isn't new knowledge. We've had indigenous communities and indigenous knowledge for centuries who understand this stuff, who have lived in harmony with nature and our kind of planetary systems for a really long time. It's just about kind of turning back to that and actually working out how we can kind of reconfigure. And in that, we might need to make some really tough decisions. And that's the piece that I think is beyond kind of sustainability, where we kind of shied away from some of those tough decisions.
Like sustainability for a lot of organizations, I'm using huge generalizations here, but it can often be a difficult sell on the basis that within the current system, I am looking at the quarter returns, I'm looking at maximization of shareholder value, and ultimately this thing, sustainability, even if you start pitching it to me in the sense of all of the wonderful business outcomes that can be achieved as a result of becoming more efficient and becoming more aligned with regulatory frameworks that allow us to win RFIs or whatever, RFPs. Brilliant. That's all great. But it's still, it can be a heavy lift, because right now I'm just concerned with how we get through the next quarter. Is regenerative, as you described, it's that next level beyond sustainability, and it almost requires an even more significant change in the kind of time frame thinking of our leaders of our businesses. How difficult is that to pitch? Like, how much of a challenge is that to try and get people that are already not necessarily like, you know, jumping overboard in order to invest in the sustainability credentials and initiatives of their organizations to go to regenerative?
Yeah, so true. It's a really difficult pitch and sell if you're thinking in the near term, because there's sort of like, I've got quarterly targets. I want to get promoted. So I want to do all of what my manager's asking me to do to get promoted. We want our business to grow and be the leader, etc. And all of those targets, all of those incentives are very kind of short term. It is a really hard sell, but actually if you want to exist in X 50, 100 years time, it's a very essential shift. And I think the organizations that shift first are going to be setting themselves up more for the future. I guess an example of where this is sort of being done, we've had 10 years of the Wellbeing for Future Generations Act that the Welsh Government implemented in 2015, where policymakers were encouraged to think about the well-being of future generations in all of the policy decisions they've made. Now, the jury's out about how well that was implemented. And I think there were pockets that was implemented really well and pockets of excellence and pockets where it was maybe kind of sidelined slightly. But it's a really great example, whereas actually the Welsh Government is recognizing we need to consider this longer term view and thinking. If we're just thinking in 4-year cycles of voting popularity, we're not going to exist in X amount of years time, or our kind of communities aren't going to be flourishing. So I think there are some pockets where that's starting to happen, but it's few and far between. So it's not an easy sell, it's not an easy shift, but it's an essential one. And actually, I think more if we're thinking about the opportunities and the benefits that come with that and the kind of flourishing rather than the change required, I think that's going to set us up for being able to make that shift.
Zoe, I love that. And I love the fact that you brought in the Welsh Government example, which we featured on the show previously as that kind of best in class policy environment or regulatory environment for organizations. But let me ask you this on that. How do we go about like encouraging, what's the language that we use in order to encourage our governments and our policymakers to adopt similar initiatives? Like, how do we package that up? Like, what does successful communication of this look like? Obviously, success would look like, you know, changes in regulation, etc. But how do we convince people that regenerative is the way to go beyond, you know, if you want to be around in 50, 100 years time, you got to do it?
Yeah. So I appreciate the language and the narratives aren't gonna suit all organizations. So it has to be packaged in terms that people can understand. So largely that could be economic terms, it could be other terms. I would love it if we could all be like Bhutan and measure gross domestic happiness rather than gross domestic profit, but that's not the state of the world right now. So I guess an example, so with the methodology I mentioned earlier with PCRAM, it's a resilience building methodology. It's for investors. It puts it into kind of economic terms, not purely economic terms, is that if that's not what you're incentivized by. But the very first step of that methodology is understanding what are your strategic objectives. And those could be financial, those could be other things, but it contextualizes all of the analysis and the work that is subsequent in those strategic objective terms so that it chimes with your decision makers, with your strategic leaders. And I think that's what's led to the global adoption of the methodology and kind of the success, is because it's nuanced enough to not just push down the throats of leaders that they need to think about climate resilience and risk, but actually, how is this going to enable you to be more successful in the things that you've already termed as what you want to be successful in the objectives that you set out? And how does that then tie to your governance and your kind of decision-making cycles? So I think there's something about working with existing objectives and narratives, whilst also kind of bringing people along the journey. Now, that will lead to incremental improvement and change. What this article is calling out for is this real kind of systemic seismic shift. But I think it's the entry point. It's the kind of door opener to be able to start kind of thinking in those terms. With then that sets the framework to then do a more kind of systemic view.
I love that. And talking through kind of what are going to be the conditions that lead to this systemic change beyond good actors, whether or not it be governments, whether or not it be individual organizations choosing to adopt this mindset and this way of viewing what they're trying to achieve. I think the article alludes to the North American insurance sector, residential sector, a number of firms now filing for bankruptcy because of the fact that they essentially cannot exist in the current environment and conditions that we find ourselves in from an environment perspective. Like, what are the other characteristics, do you think, of the future that will stimulate this kind of leaning towards or sort of adoption of regenerative practices and principles? Can you foresee what you think those things might be? Because I'm going to throw my penny's worth in. I think the thing with a lot of this stuff is that it's when the problems really come home to people and their lived experience, and it becomes a more immediate local experience that then stops them to think, my goodness, we cannot keep operating this way. We've got to do it another. And we just have to hope that at that moment, those changes of the way that people behave and the way that organizations operate, that we haven't missed the boat.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's when it gets to the point where it's impacting people's livelihoods, which we know is happening today, is when those shifts start to create. So an example would be American farming practices have taken quite an extractive view for a really long time, using monocropping practices, tilling, and it's really impacted the soil health, which has meant that farmers are getting less and less yields. And because that's affecting the livelihoods of this significant industry in America, there's now this seismic shift in thinking and mindset and practice to a more regenerative approach, because it leads to healthier soils, which leads to higher yields. So it's hit the farmers in the fields, which is the yields and the kind of the livelihoods of those industries, which has led to that change in practice. Now, if we could be more proactive with that and not let it get to the point where we're having just mass desertification globally and leading to really kind of unhealthy soils, then we wouldn't need to kind of make the change in that really kind of short time frame, we can do that over a much more slower and more kind of intentional time frame, which would be much more fruitful globally. There's been some really promising changes happening, and the Earth can heal if we enable it. So yeah.
We've talked a little bit about the stick there, I think, in terms of when we talk about regenerative practices and mindsets. What are the kind of, what are the major carrots that we're looking at here for organizations that do this now, perhaps beyond what you said earlier, which is prepare yourself more proactively, to succeed later on down the line? What are the other sort of major outcomes?
We saw this shift when organizations were moving from understanding their sustainability requirements, which was seen as a kind of nice to have or a good thing to do, to this more ESG approach, which was actually looking at your kind of core business and how it makes money, how it kind of manages risk, but also how it governs itself. And so I think organizations have a precedent set there to really look at their core business and how it operates and see the opportunities that strike within that. Because I think it was a big learning curve when ESG was implemented, and a lot of the large organizations had to set up teams almost what felt like overnight to kind of cope with the expectations to manage the ESG requirements that were coming through. But the largest thing that I think has changed in organizational mindset is actually there's huge opportunity here. Whereas it was seen as a kind of, oh gosh, we need to do something, to actually, if we implement this part of our business where we've done the analysis, we've done the work, and we've seen it has the largest opportunity, we can create not only shareholder confidence, which I know a lot of organizations care about, but also our talent are going to stay around for longer because they are motivated and they understand that we are doing good and we are driving impact. But also our customers are going to be happier because we're building that longer term value. We're seeing, rather than a kind of more short term extractive view, we can build those relationships for the much more longer term and have co-benefits within our customer and our supply chain. So there are kind of opportunities that have been presenting themselves for some time, that organizations that have not just done the tick box exercise, but have actually genuinely thought about how and why their organization exists and what are the products, services, and customers they want to support in the future. So if organizations have done that well, they have the precedent there to really lean into those opportunities, really drive change, and be the organizations that are thriving in the future. If there are organizations that are just starting out on that journey or who haven't quite thought that through, then this provides a really great framework to start thinking about how to even tackle that thinking. And so Hannah links to some really great resources in the article. There are, I think it's 100 or so pages, and it takes you step by step into that how. And that's how to build that regenerative mindset. It all starts with the mindset, to understand what systems you're operating in. Often there might be a systems mapping exercise, which is quite fun, that you can do with organizations to really understand, okay, what systems are we operating in? How does that impact us, and vice versa? And then the opportunities comes within the tension between those systems in the space, and those that can take that on and run with it. So one example that Hannah gave in the article, because unfortunately a lot of the examples I have, I am not able to talk about publicly. But one of the examples I think is really quite compelling is the Danish company Overstory, who used to be really reliant on fossil fuel and has moved dramatically towards renewable energy and has found a lot of success in that because they were early, a first mover. They are now taking a large share of that market whilst also contributing to this kind of more renewable, more regenerative practice and approach. And you can see it in their bottom line. Their bottom line is going up. It's not something that you have to sacrifice your economic success for. Actually, that's a huge part of regeneration. It's part of the system. It's just that redistribution to understanding how you can do that in a way that that supports kind of future thriving.
I love it, Zoe, and thank you so much for pulling out examples that we can talk about and to sort of ground it in that. What are your thoughts on? This wasn't mine. This is somebody else that referred to this. Using or specifically looking at waste as the sort of gateway, if you like, to getting people to start thinking about regenerative thinking within their business or regenerative operation within their business, because the vast majority of businesses, one way or another, produce waste. And to change the thinking of that is waste to that is resource, and how ultimately can we utilize that in some way, in some fashion, that in itself is the most simplistic form of regenerative thinking, is it not?
I love this question because this really personifies that view of actually thinking more systemically and the challenges between the systems. And that's often where the waste is, and often where the low-hanging fruit opportunity is. And circularity has been around for a really long time. And actually organizations that have really taken that on and harnessed that circular economy and circular thinking are the ones that are more efficient with their resources. So therefore, they're wasting less of their bottom line, but also creating value and opportunity within that. And that also drives resilience, because you're having a business model that is multifaceted. You're not just kind of a one-track, you're not just on a one-track mind. You're actually creating opportunity around not only what you're selling, but also what you're not selling, and then providing a value stream around that. So yeah, I think it's a really important point. So there's some really great examples of collaborative and collective organizations that are creating their own system to distribute and share resources and wealth. So there's a community in Northern Europe that have done just that, and established, I would say, nearly a decade ago, where they recognized actually we're in an industrial sector where we've got waste product that others can use. We can share energy and be more resilient by creating this network of sharing resources and create a more kind of ecosystem of sharing, rather than having to spend a really long time or lots of resources working out what do I do with my waste. Actually, there might be a neighbor or a kind of complementary organization that would need that, and you can kind of create these ecosystems within maybe even your own community. So there's a really great example there. I'll find the link, because that's a quite an old example, but a great one that's been happening for a long time.
Zoe, that was a brilliant, I know whistle stop tour, but that was a brilliant reflection on some of the themes in the article. I know that we didn't get to cover everything, but for now, can I ask you the magic wand question to conclude? So if I was to hand you a magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be?
Well, firstly, if I'm able to design my wand based on what we've talked about, I'd want my wand to be based on circular materials, fully biodegradable. As it biodegrades, it kind of leaches positive materials into the soil. No, I joke. But if I were to wave this magic wand, I'd want to give decision makers some goggles to really see into the future and really have that long-term lens, and to imagine exactly how their decisions impact the future. Because I think it is just quite a tricky thing for people to imagine. And I think too often, as we've talked about, decisions are just driven by immediate gains, and it just loses sight of the point and the kind of longer term vision. And I really want to kind of imagine if that was the case, and decision makers, and I guess we're all decision makers, so maybe everyone would have access to these goggles. But if decision makers were able to kind of take that long-term view and really kind of visualize the impact that they're creating, I can so imagine it. We'd live in a world where we're having these really thriving kind of green communities. Everyone is happy, and we're incentivizing well-being and happiness over kind of consumption and profit. And I mentioned Bhutan earlier, but I'm really just imagining like a modern Bhutan, kind of building on those things. Everyone's living a more slower, intentional life, but it has this kind of ripple effect where we're living in these thriving communities. That's what I would love to see, and I would be really proud to exist in a world that's really kind of thinking about the systemic impacts and that long-term vision.
Zoe, I absolutely love it. You've used your magic wand to, which is obviously you've redesigned and produced as to using certain materials, to literally produce magic goggles, which we're then going to have and distribute across the world for people to see in the future. I think it's such a, again, we get to think ridiculously in many ways with this, but it's such a brilliant idea. Like the idea that, every one of us as consumers, as directors, as people involved in government, etc., we, if we could have a sense of the decisions that we've made during our day, week, month, year, and ultimately the implications of those decisions. Like that would be an amazing thing for us to just have that feedback, that very immediate feedback on, what the impact would be long term. That would be transformational. It would be great to see. Again, I don't follow enough of this, but I'd love to know from a sort of climate comms perspective, how the films that are out there that try and do this. I imagine that there are numerous films, and we're obviously recording at the point of COP30 at the moment. I have some vague recollection that the people are trying to produce these types of both, not just sort of the damning version of look at the future from it with a really negative gaze, if you like, if we continue down the route that we're going down, but actually the very aspirational view of imagine what the world could look like if we got a bit more Bhutan and adopted these principles on a broader scale.
So I'm reading a book at the moment which really does this brilliantly in quite a scary way, but it's called Losing Eden by Lucy Jones. And the very first chapter is it's a kind of scene in the future where a young girl is talking to her grandma and trying to imagine what nature is like, because nature doesn't exist anymore. And it's so chilling, it's brilliantly written, and it's really quite striking. So if anyone wants to reimagine a future without nature and kind of get really inspired to safeguard and drive restoration, I'd really recommend Losing Eden by Lucy Jones.
Zoe, that's absolutely brilliant. You've shared some referrals to some brilliant resources and things for people to check out after the show. But thank you so much for joining me this morning. As I say, I know it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there's been some brilliant stuff in there. So thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A big, big thank you to Zoe Duvall for joining me on today's show. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.